This is the new McLaren Artura, and it's McLaren's latest supercar. It replaces the 570S, which had been McLaren's entry-level model since it came out back in 2015. And today, I'm going to take you on a tour of it. Before I get started, be sure to check out Cars and Bids, which is my new enthusiast car auction website. We've had some amazing sales recently, including this beautiful blue BMW wagon, which sold for $28,000, this low-mileage Ford Excursion, which sold for just over $25,000, and this beautiful blue Lexus ISF, which sold for just under $32,000. If you're looking to sell a cool car from the 1980s and up, the modern era, Cars and Bids is the place to do it. And if you're looking to buy a cool modern enthusiast car, check it out, carsandbids.com. I've borrowed the Artura from McLaren Newport Beach, which is the McLaren dealership here in Newport Beach in Southern California. McLaren Newport Beach has all of the latest McLaren models, although not the Artura just yet. It goes on sale later this year. But thank you to McLaren Newport Beach for letting me check out the Artura while they had it temporarily. You can check out McLaren Newport Beach by clicking the link in the description below. So let's talk Artura. There's a lot to cover with this car, but probably the biggest news is the engine. Gone is the V8 from previous McLaren models. Instead, you have a new V6 mated to an electric motor, so this is a plug-in hybrid with a V6. That's a big departure, but it makes some pretty good numbers. 670 horsepower. McLaren says 0 to 60 in 3 seconds with a top speed of 205 miles an hour. And it can go about 20 miles on pure electric power alone with no gasoline engine intervention at all. Now, this is a pre-production model of the Artura, so I won't be able to drive it, but the real one should be out in a few months. And I can still take you on a tour and show you the quirks and features of the Artura, or at least as many as I possibly can from a pre-production car. So let's get started. All right, I'm going to start the quirks and features of the Artura with just getting in, where you have a door handle. Now, this is a big development because previous McLaren models have had like a sensor, and then they had like a little pad that was hidden in an intake. And after years of experimentation, apparently McLaren has decided the easiest way to get into a car door is with a door handle. And so here it is. It's very obvious. You just kind of stick your hand in here, lift up, and that's how you open the door. By the way, also worth noting, there is a new key for this car. Take a look at it here. It has sort of a cool new look compared to other McLaren models. You can see in the middle, there's a McLaren with the trunk open. Obviously, that's how you access the trunk. The button with the McLaren logo, that unlocks the doors. You press the McLaren logo to begin your McLaren experience. But anyway, next up, once you climb inside, you discover there are quite a few changes in here compared to previous McLaren models. Now, the most striking is in the center. This screen is no longer integrated into the dashboard molding. Instead, it's sort of tacked on and aimed towards the driver, and it certainly looks very different from previous McLaren models, or frankly, most other cars. Now, like I said, this is a pre-production car, and unfortunately, the screens in here don't work, so I can't show you how this stuff actually operates, but I can show you how it looks when it's turned off, and it certainly is an interesting, quirky little center screen. You have only one real physical button on this center screen, and that's this one on the side. It's a dial. You can move it, obviously, and I suspect that will end up controlling stereo volume, or you can push it in, and I suspect that will turn on or off the stereo and mute it. But that is your center screen in the Artura, very different from other McLarens. Now, moving down from the center screen, the controls in the center console will be very familiar to people who have had experience with other McLaren models. R, N, and V, obviously for reverse, neutral, and drive. You also have your hazard light switch here and your engine start-stop switch here. This is pretty much the same as in current McLaren models, even though this one is brand new. Now, around those controls in the center, worth noting, you do have two cup holders in here. You have one sort of directly in between the seats, and then you have one at the very furthest forward point in the center console, although that is not very accessible because of the positioning of this center screen. Worth noting, by the way, this center screen is fixed in place. It doesn't like swivel between driver and passenger, so accessing that cup holder will be a chore. But you do have 2 cup holders in an exotic supercar, which is a pretty nice thing. And frankly, there's a lot of nice things in this car sort of geared towards more convenience and more day-to-day livability. For example, you have adaptive cruise control in this car. That is pretty impressive in an exotic sports car. I haven't seen that yet. Adaptive cruise, so it will slow down and speed up based on the positioning of the car in front of you. Seeing that on a lot of new models lately, but exotic sports cars haven't had it, but this one does. You also have lane departure warning in this car, meaning you start to like swerve out of your lane, the car will beep and let you know, hey, take control, you're swerving. That is pretty impressive convenience features from an exotic sports car. And here's another nice convenience benefit that current McLaren owners will love. To the left of the steering wheel, there is a button that raises the front of the car, the axle lifter. You push that and the front goes up. I mentioned this as a big convenience feature because on previous McLarens, the axle lifter was hidden in the gauge cluster menus, and you had to use this little stalk on the side of the wheel to find the axle lifter. It took forever, and you were usually trying to use it in a high stress situation where cars behind you were waiting and you were trying to clear a driveway, and it was so embarrassing. Well, now you just push a button and the axle lifter goes up. Again, a nice convenience feature. And more features that help with daily livability in the center console. This little pad isn't just an armrest. You can open it up and it's a little storage area, and it has 3 different types of charge ports in here. You have USB, USB-C, and a traditional cigarette lighter outlet style charge port for several different devices all at once. That is pretty nice to see, especially in an exotic sports car. Usually they don't prioritize that kind of stuff. And another benefit for daily livability, the seats. You can see here you have these racing bucket seats like a lot of exotic sports cars have, and usually such seats are very uncomfortable and kind of fixed in their position, but not here. You can move these seats forward or backwards like in any normal car, but there's also a button that allows you to tilt them. So if you want to recline, you can do that, which isn't a feature of all fixed sport bucket seats. A lot of them just move forward or backwards, maybe up or down, but these will also tilt backward and forward to make for a more comfortable driving experience. And next up, moving on to some other interesting quirks in here beyond daily livability. One thing you'll notice instantly if you've spent time in other McLarens, the old school switches to change the drive mode are gone. In previous McLaren models, you had like several different switches that you could turn between 3 different modes, and there was an activate button that you had to press to activate these switches. Those are no longer in this car. Instead, the drive modes are controlled with these little controls on the side of the gauge cluster. You have one over on the left that says H, which controls, I guess, your handling, and one over on the right which says P, which I suspect is like performance, like acceleration, or putting the car in the electric drive mode. But you can adjust these switches and that will change the drive mode. When the gauge cluster is functional, obviously, we can see how that works. But right now you can tell this is the new generation of like McLaren drive mode adjusters here on the side of the gauge cluster, which, by the way, itself is worth noting because the gauge cluster is kind of cool. 2 interesting things about it. For one, these little dials that control the drive mode are shaped in an odd way because there's this like aerodynamic side to the gauge cluster. It makes it look a lot more interesting than your typical car gauge cluster, this sort of carbon fiber piece on the side going into these switches. Also worth noting, the gauge cluster moves with the steering wheel. You have this little switch below the steering wheel. You can move it up, down, backwards, forwards, and when you move it like down, the gauge cluster will also go down, so it's not fixed in place. And that way, regardless of where you have the steering wheel height set, the gauge cluster will be directly above it, which makes it easier for visibility and for different drivers of different heights to be comfortable in the car. Now, in spite of some big new features in here, like the drive mode adjusters and the center screen and the gauge cluster, there are some familiar pieces from other older McLaren models. For instance, the stalks coming off the steering wheel, you still have the same distinctive turn signal stalk and windshield wiper stalk with like the hole in the middle, very thin. McLarens have used this for years, and this one still does. Same thing with this dial to adjust the mirrors. You can move this switch left or right, or push to turn on and off the parking sensors. This is also pulled from older McLaren models, and that's also true of the light switch over on the side. Same thing from other older McLaren models. So there are some familiar older McLaren items in here, but most of this interior looks and feels completely brand new. Next up, a few other interesting quirks in here. For one, you put the sun visor down and the sun visor is down, but you'll notice there's no visor mirror. That's because the visor mirror mirror goes down separately. You put that down, and then the visor mirror has gone down independent of the visor. I guess the thinking is you can put the visor down just by itself if you do not want to look at yourself. If you are a hideous person and you don't want to see yourself while you're being shielded by the sun, then you don't have to in this McLaren. Here's another interesting quirk. This car contains the world's smallest cargo storage compartment. It is in the front seat, in between the thigh support. This tiny little compartment is for you to store stuff, although I'm not entirely sure what you'd store in there. It is definitely too small for a cell phone. Interestingly, this compartment is only on the driver's side. The passenger does not get their own tiny storage compartment. Only the driver has the ability to store highly important items such as thimbles and bottle caps. Next up, another interesting quirk in this car. On the ceiling near the rear view mirror, you have a button marked SOS. So if you're in trouble in your McLaren, you press that and someone will come save you. No, I assume that's for like roadside assistance or whatever, but it is interesting to see that in there, the SOS button in a McLaren. But anyway, you're in the interior, you want to get out of the interior, so how exactly do you do that? Well, there's this. This is the door handle release. You can see it's an image of a McLaren with the door up. You pull that and then the door electronically pops open, and that's how you climb out of the Artura. Now, when you're getting out, you will notice one interesting thing on the door sill. You can see part of the door sill is carbon fiber and part of it is carpeted. Now, on previous McLaren models, if you've got a carbon door sill, the whole thing was carbon, but that can scuff easily and it's a little uncomfortable when you're getting in or out. Now you have carpeting here and carbon fiber, which makes for a more comfortable experience, makes it easier to get in or out, but you also don't lose that carbon fiber that you want on the door sill. And by the way, before I completely get out, speaking of carpeting in this car, behind the seats there is a carpeted shelf. And actually, it's a pretty large sized carpeted shelf where you could store some luggage if you wanted to, frankly, for extra space. Although there is a warning label back there that explicitly forbids you to store luggage in that space. But I suspect you could do it if you really needed to cram a lot of luggage into your Artura. And next up, we move outside the Artura to what is sure to be the most controversial part of this car, and that would be the engine. Gone is the old school turbo V8, replaced instead by a turbo V6 mated to an electric motor. Now, there are some reasons for this change. For one thing, the V6 is lighter, 110 pounds lighter than the V8, which is obviously going to be a benefit for performance. Also, the V6 is now 3 liters, which allows McLaren some tax breaks when selling the car in certain countries that tax vehicles based on engine size. This just sneaks under the 3000cc engine classification, and so it can be sold for a lower price, which will drive more sales. But also, this is a pretty impressive engine, at least on paper. 3-liter twin-turbo V6 makes 580 horsepower and 430 pound-feet of torque just by itself. Then you add in an electric motor, which adds another 100 horsepower and some additional torque, and the result is 670 horsepower and 530 pound-feet of torque. Those are big figures, and they're a huge step up over the outgoing 570S. And when you think about it, 670 horsepower is an especially big figure in this segment. So what segment is that? Because the Ferrari F8 has like 700 horsepower. But this car reportedly will be starting around $230,000. The F8 has a $50,000 higher base sticker price, and then of course Ferrari options can take it stratospheric from there. So this car will be like 20%, 18% cheaper than a Ferrari F8. In terms of price comparisons, this is a little bit closer to like a Portofino or a 911 Turbo S, and in that realm, 670 horsepower is a really big figure, and 0 to 60 in 3 seconds is pretty impressive. But anyway, since I'm back here, let's go over a few interesting engine quirks and features. Now, you can't access the engine, at least not very easily. This whole rear clamshell is one large piece. It's not fixed in place, but it can't be removed except with like special tools that only your McLaren service center has. So you, the individual, the person who buys this car, you can't get into your engine and check it out. out, but you can see it through these little holes in the rear compartment a little bit better than you could see previous McLaren engines. And if you want to add fluids, you can do that. This little flap in back will open up, and it's called like the service flap, and it allows you to add fluids if you need to your engine. But otherwise, they don't really want you screwing around with the engine in these things, so fluids is pretty much all you can do. Although, it is worth noting that directly in front of the little fluid flap, you have a little hole. That is the heat chimney. I am serious, that is what it's called. Basically, it's intended to send heat from the engine up through this chimney. You can see that's exactly what it is inside the engine bay and through this hole and then out into the world. And actually, it's a little bit hard to see, but you can see in this reflection the heat actually coming up out of the heat chimney as the car is cooling down after it's been turned on, and that's what it's for, the McLaren Artura heat chimney. Bet your car doesn't have one of those. Now, it's important to mention the heat chimney because that is not the exhaust in this car. It just sends out heat. Instead, the exhaust is in the back, in the center, like in other McLaren models, right in the middle, sort of prioritized above everything else in back. And I just love those two exhaust pipes in back looking cool. Now, one other interesting thing back here, you will see right in the middle, you have the McLaren logo, and it says McLaren, and it says Artura, which is interesting. There's been some complaints that pretty much all the McLaren models look alike, or there are so many different McLaren models that it's getting hard to tell them apart. So this car actually says the name on it, which is unusual for exotic cars. Most of them just let the design and styling do the talking, and if you know, you know, and they're really badged with the name. This is an uncommon feature, but I think McLaren, because they're still a little bit struggling with brand identity and with people figuring out which is which, having the name on there, they might find to be useful because it's a little hard to tell the cars apart, frankly. But back to the exhaust for a second. Now, like I've said, this is a pre-production car, so it doesn't like fully rev. We can't hear the engine completely, but I can do a cold start of this new engine. So take a listen to McLaren's latest power plant starting up. Now, as for rear lighting, interesting back here, you no longer have sort of the swoop of previous McLaren models and of the 570S. Instead, it's just a thin line. You can see right now, this is the tail light on, just sort of a thin strip in back. Very simple lighting. And with the turn signal on, you can see that replaces the tail light or the brake light on either side. Again, a thin strip that blinks as the turn signal. Nothing particularly crazy or interesting with the lighting in this car, except in the sense that it's kind of minimalist. And next up, we move up to the front of the Artura, and you have a similar situation with the turn signals up front. Again, very minimalist, just a thin strip of turn signal in the front, and it blinks as the turn signal, and nothing too crazy or distinctive with the styling of that signal. Now, when the signal is off, you can see on the other side, that's your daytime running light. That is, of course, the LED light that is always on when you're just cruising around. But when you turn on the signal, it replaces the daytime running light and becomes a turn signal. Pretty simple up here. Again, nothing too unusual or quirky with the lighting in this car. But there is one very interesting quirk up front that you might not notice unless you look closely. You can see at the very bottom of the front end, sort of right in the center, it's asymmetrical. On one side, you have this like black pad, and on the other side, you don't. So what's going on there? So weird to see asymmetrical designs in any car. That black pad is the radar sensor for the adaptive cruise control system. Very well integrated, because I never would have noticed that it's asymmetrical up front unless someone had pointed it out, but that's where it is. So that's where your radar is looking forward to speed up and slow down based on what the car in front of you is doing. By the way, one other convenience feature I forgot to mention inside, you can see up here you have a camera, and that camera is used with other cameras around the car to create a 360-degree camera system top down like you have in crossovers and SUVs. Well, McLaren has it too. Now, it's worth noting McLaren already had this. This was available in other McLaren models before, but it's also going to be available in the Artura, and that's a pretty big deal for an exotic sports car to have a 360 camera. Again, adding to the convenience features of this car, like adaptive cruise control and lane departure warning. Most exotic cars have not adopted any of that stuff. stuff yet. But of course, you really want a 360 camera in an exotic car because they're hard to park and very valuable if you mess anything up. So it really is a nice feature to have, and McLaren has it. And next up, we move on to the front trunk in the Artura, which is probably the least interesting thing about the whole car, frankly. It looks like every other exotic car front trunk and every other McLaren front trunk. It's pretty large, pretty sizable actually. You could put some decent luggage in here for like a weekend trip away, but there's nothing too interesting or unusual in this front trunk. Just a front trunk. And next up, moving on to some other interesting quirks and features on the outside of the Artura. One is these little louvers on the front fenders. These are standard. On previous McLaren models, they have been a very expensive option. They are now standard on the Artura, standard in body color, or you can get them carbon fiber like these. But either way, they sort of add to the visual drama on the outside of this car. Another cool exterior quirk that most people probably won't notice or pick up on is underneath the door. If you look under the door behind the front wheel, you can see the body doesn't extend as far down as the door does. The door like goes down even further. That's because there's a hidden air channel behind the door in that spot on the very bottom. And you can see with the door up, the air channel kind of going down the bottom of the door. And you can also see where it goes into, the back of the car somewhere. It has some sort of cooling function, I assume. I don't exactly know what it does, but there is an air channel in there that is surely functional and hidden for most people, unless you're looking really closely. And two other exterior items worth mentioning. For one thing, this color, Ember Orange is what they call it. I think it looks great. It's really cool. And next up, let's talk about the plug-in component of this car for a second. Like I said, this is a plug-in hybrid. So the gasoline engine made it to an electric engine. You can plug it in, charge it up, and drive for about 20 miles on pure electric power alone if you want to, which is pretty cool. Now, to plug it in, you do that here, or possibly here. One of these is the fuel door, and the other one is where the plug goes. But either way, it's pretty seamlessly integrated into this car because it looks just like a fuel door, so you expect it to be there, and it doesn't look out of place at all. And by the way, this is the charger itself. Nothing particularly unusual or weird or surprising there, but that's the plug-in architecture for the Artura. Now, the last thing I want to talk about with this car is the way that it looks, which I think is pretty interesting. Two big observations here. For one, it does look like an evolved 570S. This is a nice looking car, there's no question about that, but it is not the radical McLaren change that we have come to expect, like with the Senna, which didn't look like anything else, or with the 720S, which didn't look like the car that came before it. This car is more evolution versus revolution, especially compared to other McLaren models. And that is especially true up front. You can really see a lot of 570S in the front of this car. Not very different from the 570S. It's certainly been modernized, but it's not a dramatic change compared to a lot of other McLarens. Now, part of that is it's just sort of the McLaren face. That's how McLarens look, and so they weren't going to change that too much. But it's worth noting you do not have a hugely radical departure in terms of styling. The biggest change here is the powertrain. With that said, it's important to note the car has been modernized compared to the 570S. So when I first saw it, I thought, oh, it just looks like a 570S, a slight change. That's not really true. When you actually see this car in person, it certainly looks like a completely different car. And if you have any real knowledge of the 570S at all, it will become clear very quickly that this isn't that. It's obviously a different vehicle. But again, more evolution rather than revolution in this car. It's definitely an evolved 570S rather than like a totally new, completely reimagined vehicle. But it is modernized, updated, and a completely different design from the 570S on the outside. And it's a totally redesigned car. This is not just a facelift of the 570S, even though to some people it does look like that. And so that's the McLaren Artura, or at least a tour of the quirks and features of this pre-production model. Now, like I said, pre-production car can't drive it, but I can't wait for the real thing to come out in the next few months so I can get even more in depth and get behind the wheel. For now, this looks like a promising replacement for the 570S. And for the people complaining, oh, it's just a hybrid V6, keep in mind, 670 horsepower, 0 to 60 in 3 seconds, and a top speed of 205 miles an hour. It may be just a hybrid V6, but this is no Lexus RX 450h. How do you say it? Artura? Artura?
I say Artura, but it's probably Artura.
I don't know.
I would guess it would be Artura.
I mean, it's Shmi.